So we just finished looking at marine biomes, and now we're moving on to freshwater biomes. So freshwater biomes are divided up into the standing freshwater biomes, which include ponds and lakes, and then the running freshwater biomes, which are the streams and rivers. So we'll start with ponds and lakes. And the distinction between ponds and lakes is that ponds are smaller and shallower, and this means that sunlight can penetrate all the way to the bottom of a pond, whereas in lakes, at least some of the water is too deep for light to penetrate. And you probably remember from the last section that in the ocean, the availability of sunlight was a significant determinant of what the food chain looked like in a marine biome. So, likewise, in lakes, there are also distinct biomes that are existing based on sunlight availability. Lakes are divided up into the littoral zone, the limnetic zone, the profundal zone, and the benthic zone. In the littoral zone, which you may have realized shares its name with a zone in the ocean that is similarly positioned. We're talking about the water that's nearest to the shore. So this means that the water is shallow enough for sunlight to penetrate, which supports the growth of producers like phytoplankton and aquatic plants. And those producers support a robust food chain of consumers that depend on them. So as you can imagine, this is a space that has a high level of biodiversity. The next zone is called the limnetic zone. And this encompasses the top layer of water that's not directly adjacent to the shore, downward to the depth where sunlight can penetrate. So remember, that's 200 meters for the photic zone. So because sunlight is available in this zone, there are producers here, primarily phytoplankton, suspended in the water, and then those support zooplankton and nectin consumers. However, because this zone is not directly adjacent to the shore and doesn't have the aquatic plants present in it, and some of the other benefits of being land adjacent, there is lower biodiversity here than in the littoral zone. The third zone is the profundal zone. The profundal zone is directly below the limnetic zone, and this describes the open water areas of the lake where sunlight cannot penetrate. So consequently, there are no producers in this area, no photosynthesis going on, just consumers who, like we saw in the lower zones of the ocean, feed on the materials that are drifting downward, or they prey on their neighbors in the profundal zone. And because of the lack of producers to support the food chain, this zone has an even lower biodiversity than the higher zones. And then finally, that brings us to the benthic zone, the very bottom of the lake, which again shares its name with the marine biome of the same space. Benthic zones are at the bottom surface of the body of water, and what this biome looks like varies based on its depth, just like in the ocean. Near the shoreline, where the water is shallow, the bottom surface of the lake is home to a diverse array of organisms because aquatic plants are growing in this area, and they provide shelter, a source of food, as well as oxygen. And examples of animals that might live in the shoreline area of the benthic zone are insects, snails, and crayfish. But when you get into deeper waters where there aren't any consumers, the benthic zone of the lake is mostly populated with decomposers, just like the deeper areas of the ocean were. So as you can see, nutrients tend to be stratified in lakes just like they do in oceans. There's a lot to eat at the top layer because of the activity of the producers. And then at the bottom, you get the dead organic matter that settles and supports the decomposers. And when we were introducing marine biomes, we mentioned this phenomenon called upwelling, which is where the ocean currents carry nutrients from the bottom layers up to the top. And something similar can happen in lakes called lake turnover. Lake turnover is a seasonal phenomenon where water will mix at different levels of the lake, depending on the time of year and the temperature conditions. So during the summer, water at the surface of the lake is heated by sunlight, and therefore it becomes warmer than the lower layers. And because warmer water is less dense than colder water, the hot water will remain at the surface, and the cool water will remain down below, and there won't be any mixing. However, as you get into the fall season, things start to cool off, including the surface of the lake, and the difference in temperature between the top and bottom layers gets smaller. So now the water is more or less at the same temperature, and that means it's at the same density, and the different layers will start to mix with each other. And this mixing is called turnover. and turnover serves to circulate nutrients throughout the different layers of the lake. Then as winter takes hold, the surface layer of the lake may freeze over and no turnover takes place during this time. But when you get into the spring, that surface ice will melt and start to heat up until the surface layer is the same temperature as the water below it. And now, again, all the layers of the water are a similar density, and you get this turnover activity happening. So this is one of the ways that nutrients get circulated throughout a lake. However, some lakes just don't have a lot of nutrients at all. In fact, the nutrient content of lakes varies greatly from lake to lake. And there are actually different terms that are used to classify lakes based on their nutrient content. And this table here lays them all out. And then it also tells you in the other columns some of the characteristics of each type of lake that arise from its nutrient content, including its productivity, clarity of the water, and oxygen level. So the first type of lake listed here is oligotrophic lakes. And you can see this is the one at the top left of the table. Oligotrophic lakes are the ones that have the lowest levels of nutrients available. And consequently, their productivity, which productivity means how much metabolic activity is running through the food chain from producers to consumers, is quite low. And without the robust growth of organisms in the lake, like plankton, the clarity of the water is very high. There's very little cloudiness, and you can easily see through the water because there is a minimal amount of microscopic organisms there to make the appearance more murky. And there's also high levels of oxygen in oligotrophic lakes because there's not just a lack of producers, but there's also a lack of consumers who would be using up the oxygen by performing cellular respiration. Here's an example of an oligotrophic lake. This is Bear Lake. It's up on the Utah-Idaho border. And this is an aerial image of the lake. And in just a moment, I'll show you an image on the ground. But getting back to the table for just a moment, the next category is mesotrophic, which has medium levels of nutrients, therefore medium productivity, medium clarity of water, and medium oxygen levels. And then you get into eutrophic lakes, which have high nutrients and high productivity. But as a result, there is low clarity and low oxygen. So you can see this trend where the higher the nutrient level, the higher the growth of microbes and algae in the lake, the lower the clarity of the water, and the lower the available oxygen level. And this should sound somewhat familiar to you. We've previously talked about eutrophication, this destructive phenomenon affecting bodies of water that experience excessive fertilizer runoff from agriculture. And in those cases of, where the productivity gets destructive, we're talking about a hypereutrophic situation. That's the last type of lake listed in the table here. So in these situations, the nutrient level is very high, so productivity is very high, at least at first. The clarity of the water is very low, and then the oxygen levels get rapidly depleted to the point where consumers no longer survive. So this is an aerial photo of, on the left side, of Lake Erie during a hypereutrophic period, which resulted from excess nutrient runoff back in 2017. So overhead, you can see the difference in clarity, which gives you an indication of the growth happening in the lake and the productivity of the lake. And if we switch over to a ground view of these two lakes, the difference is perhaps even more apparent. So on the left, again, is Lake Erie during an algal bloom, and on the right is the oligotrophic Bear Lake in Utah. So at this point, we're going to turn our attention to the other freshwater biomes, the streams and rivers. We'll start by making some general notes of comparison between running freshwater and standing freshwater biomes. Running freshwater biomes generally contain more dissolved oxygen than standing freshwater biomes because most of the water in a running freshwater environment gets exposed to the air. As you can see in this video clip, the churning activity that happens when rivers are cutting their path across the land results in a lot of mixing, and so virtually all of the water in the river gets exposed to air intermittently and dissolves oxygen when it has that exposure. Running freshwater also contains a continuous supply of nutrients from runoff and from the decomposition of dead aquatic organisms or terrestrial organisms that fell in the water. So the presence of different zones that vary based on nutrition and sunlight is not as prominent of a thing in running water as it was in standing water. Within streams and rivers, algae are the main producers supporting the food chain. If the water is slow flowing, then they can grow abundantly, whereas if it is fast flowing, they will be less abundant and perhaps have to adhere to surfaces in the river, like rocks, in order to remain stationary. In those images on the screen, you can see on the left a slow flowing river, and on the right, a faster flowing river, and the differences in the concentration of the algae. Plants can also support the food chain in streams and rivers, and they can take several routes to surviving in the river. They may cling to rocks, float on the surface of the water, or grow out of the sediment at the bottom. And then the algae and aquatic plants, the producers, will support consumers in the food chain, which include insects, snails, clams, crayfish, and amphibians. And just like when we talked about the intertidal zone of the ocean and how organisms needed to be adapted to the flowing in and out of the tides, organisms that live in running water have to be adapted too. Aquatic plants may exhibit long, narrow leaves that minimize resistance to the flowing water, such as the ones that you see in this photo. Animals, such as insects, may have hooks or filaments that allow them to anchor to surfaces and avoid being washed away. Other animals, like fish, have fins and very streamlined body shapes that are well suited to swimming against the current of the river. And while we're on the topic of rivers, we do need to touch briefly on another zone that is closely entwined with rivers, and that is riparian zones. So, a riparian zone is the term used to describe the interface between running fresh water and the land. And what is considered to be a part of the riparian zone is the vegetation that grows along the water's edge, as well as the animals that reside at the interface. So in this image, you can see pretty clearly what would be considered the riparian zone around the Verde River, which is a river that runs through the central part of Arizona, a bit north of us. And riparian zones are very important. They play lots of important roles in the river ecosystem. They filter pollution that comes from surface runoff before it reaches the river. They keep water clear by trapping sediment runoff. They protect riverbanks from erosion because the root systems of plants growing along the river can help stabilize the soil. And they provide shade that moderates the temperature of the water and keeps it from getting too hot. Our final aquatic biome is wetlands. Wetlands are areas that are covered in water for at least one season of the year, and they're also colloquially referred to as swamps, marshes, or bogs. Because of being waterlogged, the underlying soil below a wetland contains little oxygen, and the plants have to be specially adapted to these conditions where little oxygen is available for their roots to perform cellular respiration. So some examples of wetland adapted plants are duckweeds and cattail. And like riparian zones, wetlands also perform important ecosystem functions. They absorb excess water from floods and runoffs. They deplete that excess runoff of excess nutrients before it empties into rivers and lakes, which can help prevent eutrophication. They lessen erosion by slowing the speed of water flow. And they provide a habitat for specialized plants and animals that actually need swampy, boggy conditions in order to survive. So, for example, here what you're seeing is an image of what's called a cranberry bog. And this is actually how cranberries grow. They grow on small shrubs that send out these long runner stems, and they spread throughout a flooded wetland bog zone, and that is how they thrive. So wetlands aren't just a challenge for living things. Some organisms are specially adapted to them and need them to survive. So on that note, regarding the amazing variety that we see in living organisms and the environments that they can be adapted to, that's a good place to leave things for this section. We're finished now looking at aquatic biomes. In our next and final section, we're going to take a closer look at biodiversity of living organisms.